great speakers from Clarity Partners who are going to be talking about embracing usability and accessibility. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our virtual session on embracing usability and accessibility presented by Clarity Partners. I am Gienna Gaeta, a senior consultant at Clarity.
I'm Suzie Miller. I'm also a senior consultant at Clarity.
And I'm Mike Roman, and I am a front-end developer for Clarity. And Clarity Partners is a consulting firm in Chicago that mostly serves Chicago and Cook County government agencies. The three of us are part of a team that works primarily in Drupal, but Clarity has other teams working in different technologies as well, and we are hiring for several different positions at the company. So be sure to check us out if you're looking for a job. And I'll post a link to our site in the Zoom Slack as well, in the Zoom chat.
Thank you, Mike, for that overview of Clarity. Suzie, can you give us an overview of our client, Pace?
Sure. So Pace is the premier suburban transit provider. They provide transit options for 284 municipalities in 6 different counties throughout Northeast Illinois. They service more than 100,000 daily riders through fixed and express routes, ADA paratransit, and ride-sharing services. We want to call special attention to that ADA paratransit portion. Pace truly believes that their services should be accessible, and this principle was important for us in determining the objectives of the website redesign.
Thank you, Suzie. So today we're going to talk about the work we did for our client, Pace, in user testing, accessibility testing, and the prototype that made those 2 tests possible. We're going to start with design, and we're just going to jump in. Suzie, you've designed websites in the past, and the first thing you kind of think of is, who are you designing for? When we took on Pace, who did you believe you were designing for?
That's a great question. So we knew that Pace had a variety of users. We had new riders who we identified as people who had never ridden Pace or tourists to the area. We had our regular riders. Those are people who ride Pace on a daily basis. Our on-demand riders and our riders with disabilities. Those are the audiences utilizing the ride-sharing and paratransit services. And then we had an outline audience, and those were our engaged community members. So these are individuals who participate in the committees or the boards at Pace.
Oh, okay. So what tied all these user groups together?
So as we all know, the individual user groups are going to have different needs for the website, but the thing that tied them all together was the main menu. So we started this project by reevaluating the information architecture of the website, and we proposed to Pace that they split their IA into 2 main buckets, those buckets being Ride Pace and Inside Pace. So if you're able to look at the screen and the slides, you can see the proposed design for the main menu. I'm going to show you another slide, and this is the proposed design for when the main menu is open. So each of these main buckets have their own menu. So Ride Pace has call outs for tools for ridership. And then you can see underneath that you have your secondary and tertiary level menu items. And then Inside Pace has the same layout. Their tools in the top are different. They're customer service, doing business, and news and events.
What did the menu look like before, Suzie?
That's a really good question. So this information architecture was a pretty drastic switch for Pace. If you're able to look at the screen, you can see the current Pace header. As you can tell, it's pretty fractured. It's not clear to me as a user where I'm supposed to go, what I'm supposed to click on. So this proposed IA and main menu were really simple for Pace. They seemed simple for Pace, and they were into the idea. But of course, we wanted to make sure that it would meet end user expectations.
Yeah, so you guys decided to do a user test. So why would doing this user test be valuable?
So other than making sure this proposed structure met user expectations, there was a lot of discussion internally within PACE about the terminology they were using in the main menu. Some people thought the terms were clear, some people thought they weren't clear. So this was another reason we decided to move forward with user tests.
Got it. So what was your starting point once you decided to do the user test?
We met with PACE in person, and we went with worksheets prepared beforehand, and then we helped them fill out these worksheets. So on the screen right now, you can see a screenshot of these worksheets, and you will be able to see that we identified the audience, the user group that PACE wanted to test, the task scenarios specific to that user group, and then we also had helped PACE determine their qualitative and quantitative metrics for the test.
And after you decided all that, what did the actual test day look like?
On test day, we had 6 participants who utilized an InVision prototype. For those that aren't familiar with InVision, it's a software that helps us turn otherwise static JPEGs into interactive prototypes. So the users were able to go through task scenarios as if they were on a developed website. Each test was about 20 minutes, and we had 6 observers watching the tests from another room.
So what were the results of the test?
We got great feedback from our users. The first is, did the proposed IA make sense to our end users? And they concluded that it did, that Ride Pace and Inside Pace made sense to them. Our users also generally approved of the terminology that PACE had identified to use in the test. And we got some actionable design feedback as well.
Yeah. What was that actionable design feedback?
Yeah, this is the good stuff. So the first thing is that when the main menu was open, the parent items were given a bold type treatment. And our users told us that just the simple bold treatment did not indicate to them that you could click on those items. So we went ahead and updated the designs. We gave that text an underlined as well as a bold treatment just to help indicate that it was clickable. We also got some feedback about how we were handling the homepage. So the prototype that the users were exposed to had a significant portion of the real estate of the homepage dedicated to a tool that we call the trip planner. And so the trip planner just allows an end user to pick a departure point and an end point and kind of, establish a time of day for the trip and then get trip recommendations. Our users told us that they wanted access to more tools. And so we took that same amount of real estate and divided it into 3 sections. So our users are now able to quickly access the real-time status of their bus, the route schedules and maps information, and the trip planner tool.
That's some cool stuff.
Yeah. So at this point, after wrapping up user testing, Gienna, your portion of the project kind of took off. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so after the user test came to a close, the next thing PACE wanted to focus on was accessibility. As Susie said at the beginning of this presentation, PACE has put a large emphasis on their ADA users, and just like they provide equal access to their bus services, they also wanted to provide equal access to their website. Our starting point for accessibility was to determine a level of compliance. We started with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as the WCAG. This is a set of guidelines put together by a renowned organization that is really out there to come up with requirements for making websites accessible. They currently have 3 compliance levels, A, AA, and AAA. A being the least amount of accessibility efforts, as in it's legal, you're good to go. AA, taking it to the next step and making the site even more compliant, and AAA being the most compliant website you can have. Unfortunately, PACE ruled out AAA right away because it would, they wouldn't be able to go AAA without compromising their content. So when deciding whether they wanted to do a AA website, Clarity took each of those AA requirements and assessed each one of them with the development team, the QA team, and the design team to see how much effort meeting each of those requirements would be. In the end, PACE concluded that they were going to launch with a level A compliance with the hopes that with enhancements after launch that they could eventually become a AA compliant site.
After you guys determined the level of compliance, Gienna, how else did you prepare for the accessibility tests?
Yeah, so our next step was to do an accessibility user test, kind of like how Suzie tested the main menu. PACE wanted to test the accessibility of their site. So we started preparing for the accessibility test by finding people with disabilities. PACE has a large community of people they consult for accessibility purposes. So they were able to get 4 users with disabilities for the website to test. They also scheduled a test environment and they set up all the technology necessary for the test, meaning they got the technology that the users were comfortable with, that they use at home, as well as the technology needed for the observers to watch everything that was going on in the other room.
What kind of tasks did you ask your users to complete?
Sure. So just like for your user test for the menu, Suzie, we wanted to give our users the same type of tests. They really revolved around what anyone would go to the PACE website for, which is how do I use a PACE bus to get where I need to go to? What time would I get there if I was on a PACE bus, and how much would it cost?
Gienna, can you tell me a little bit more about your test participants, like what qualified them for the test and maybe what kind of technologies they used?
Sure. So if you go to the next screen, you'll see a matrix of users that we tested. There were a total of 4 users, 2 of them who were legally blind and 2 of them who had intellectual disabilities. For the users who were blind, we had them test on both desktop and their mobile devices. On desktop, they used a software called JAWS, which is a popular screen reader, which reads everything on a screen to the user so that they can experience a website without needing to see it. And similarly, the iPhone and Samsung have pre-programmed screen readers on their phones so that they could accomplish the same goal on their phones. The users with intellectual disabilities just used a regular desktop and mouse. You'll see at the bottom, we rated the users with an ease of use score. As you can see with Jim, he was rated a 4, and we really gave these scores based on the time it took to complete each assignment. We discovered that Jim was a 4 because he has been blind his whole life, so he has used the assistive technology JAWS and his screen reader for a very long time, so he was very comfortable completing the tasks. He was just a pro going through each one, finding what he needed and moving on, whereas someone like Maurice, who had recently become blind, it took them a little bit longer to complete each task just because they weren't as familiar with their own technology.
What else did you learn from the test?
So we learned that the prototype we created was accessible. In the end, we concluded that all of the users were able to complete each 12 assignments. That was a great success for us and PACE. And that, everyone uses technology differently, and PACE really decided that they're going to stick with their design, they're going to stick with what we're going with for their new site. So in order to test a successful prototype, someone had to build a successful prototype. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about how he made that possible.
All right. Well, there were three main things going through my head as I was implementing the accessibility demo site. And the first one was to make the code portable so I wouldn't have to repeat a lot of work. Since we decided that the live site was going to be in Drupal 8, it was an easy choice for me to also build the demo site in Drupal 8. And the second was to respect the scope, timeline, and budget for this phase of the project by keeping my focus on accessibility and meeting the success criteria we agreed with the client that we were going to cover. Other things such as loading all of their content or having all of the theming completely polished was out of scope for this phase and was saved for the next phase of the project, which was building a launch-ready website. And third was to go through Susie's designs and tackle the more complicated things first. And there were two things about her designs that stood out to me. First was this component you can see on the left that I called tab tables. I used a contributed module to implement this, but the screen reader we tested with was skipping over the table data. And we decided the best course of action with respect to both accessibility and the project timeline was to simplify the design of this component and not use tabs. And second on the right, I knew the main menu would also be complicated, even before taking accessibility into account. This image on the right here is part of that flyout menu that you saw earlier. I used a contributed module to implement this as well, but because it is a part of the menu, but also different and more complicated than the other normal menu items. And in addition, we also had to cover the accessibility part of the main menu. So I needed to use custom JavaScript to implement the area tags, so those using screen readers could know if the flyout was open or closed. I needed to create a close button for the layout for the flyout and make sure it was accessible via the keyboard. And I also needed to ensure the HTML structure was correct, so that those exclusively using screen readers or keyboards would be able to navigate the menu structure. And after finishing the accessibility demo, we were ready for phase 2 of the project, building the site that PACE would go live with. I could have continued adding to the demo site until it was launch ready, but instead I decided to keep the demo site intact and start with a completely fresh Drupal install and then port over the code from the demo. This helped me review my own code during this transition process and make any necessary adjustments before starting the phase 2 work, like creating content types and views and all that other Drupal stuff. And we're still working on that. We're not done yet, but I'll say that things are going well so far, and we are expected to go live next month. And so that's all we have. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, we'll just cover a couple of logistical things before we take them, but you're welcome to ask questions. So we have contribution day this Saturday. It's obviously going to be virtual, like this whole MidCamp week. So it's going to be Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And I'd love to get Andrew to pitch his contribution day plans.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say something briefly. On Contribution Day, I spoke earlier about a live captioning tool, and we're going to be using that time on Saturday to define a few more things about our free tool that helps any event become accessible by using captioning. I also will take this time to thank Clarity, so all three of you, for the organization you work for to sponsor the actual captions for all of our sessions today. So it's much appreciated. We actually have a live captioners and closed captioning available for all these sessions, and transcripts will be up on the MidCamp site. With that, we should take some questions, and I can read them off. One of them, thanks for answering mine of 0 was not useful and 5 was very useful for the scores that you gave. That was very helpful. But another question here that we have is, what was your solution to tabbed table replacement, Mike?
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that the module we tried was called A11Y paragraph tabs, because we used Drupal paragraphs to for most of our content. My gut feeling when looking at the design was that it might be too complicated for a screen reader to handle. I wasn't sure, and we really just made I think we just made the tables just stacked vertically instead of using tabs at all.
I had a question. You said you used a contribution for the main menu. What was it for the flyout menu? Did you say what module that was?
No, I didn't, but I anticipated that question. We used menu item extras, and that just allows you to add different fields. And in our case, we just use a paragraph field for that. So we have a field for the icon image, and you know, a link, just like a normal menu item link, and those to make the three those 3 items going across the flyout. Those were just 3 of those paragraph types connected to the that first level of the menu. So in our case, the ride pace and inside pace.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I've used the menu item extras, so that's really cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. You can ask questions to Suzie or Gienna too. You don't have to just.
You're handling them so well, Mike.
I'll ask, I'll keep going. Were you able to participate, each one of you, in observing the people using for the user tests? Or was that information that you received after the fact?
So for the menu user test, Suzie was the moderator and I was one of the observers. For the accessibility test, I was the moderator and we had some other people on our team observe. So it was cool for me because I got to be both a moderator and an observer. So I had watched Suzie moderate her user test since she went first. So when I went to moderate my accessibility test, I kind of got to see how it was all going to happen.
What was the biggest impact of observing? That must have been really, really interesting.
It was really interesting. It was cool to time the users, and for a few things, we watched them struggle on like one specific point in the user test, and that was actually they couldn't click on they would go to click on the item in the menu that wasn't highlighted that Suzie ended up putting underlines under, and we just watched them, and you know, in the other room, you're just like, oh, you're hovering over it, just click it. But other than that, you know, it went pretty smoothly. Suzie had a cool setup where we took notes of what they were doing on Post-it notes. So at the end of the day, all our notes on what all the users did were up on the board. Actually, I think there's a picture of it in the results section. Right?
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, so you could kind of see that E, F, those are each one of the users, and we had little notes on each one pinned up on the board.
That's great. There's a question in the channel, and Roger, I can unmute you if you want to ask yourself. You could raise your hand. If I can find you. You are unmuted if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there.
Hello.
Can you hear
Hey.
me? Not sure if this is working.
We can hear you. Yep. While we're waiting, Mark also had a question, and I unmuted Mark. So as soon as Roger gets it figured out, Mark, do you want to go ahead and talk? You should be able to.
Doesn't
right.
seem like he's unmuted.
All right, well, I'll read them off. For Roger, do you know if there's any sort of online virtual accessibility focused testing available, kind of like usertesting.com?
I don't know. We only really consulted the WCAG guidelines, but maybe someone else would know.
Is this sort of like getting users for testing?
Looking at the link, yeah. I think it means focus group testing. Yep, that's what Roger's saying. So being able to find people to help test. Pace had a built-in community who can help them test. Do you know if there's any other ability? Yeah, not every organization has access to a community like Pace does. That's very unique. I don't know of any.
So we have leveraged a relationship with City Tech Collaborative in the past. Clarity didn't do this with the PACE project, but there used to be an organization called the Cut Group who was kind of absorbed by City Tech Collaborative, and we utilized them as a resource to find test participants in the past.
Cool. I know we're at time. We can go a little bit over here. Mark was asking, for users of assisted devices, is there any room for using progressive enhancement to keep it simple for assisted users and then doing something fancier for other users?
That's a good question. I think that, well, at least with the WCAG guidelines, there just at least needs to be an accessible alternative for things. But as far as taking that approach, I think that is possible, but we just didn't explore that for this project.
I can speak a little bit. A project I'm on now, there's a need for like an ambient video in the background, and that is what I would call something fancier for users, and that's okay to use as long as people that need to turn it off and keep it turned off have that ability. Then that's what we implement. So we try not to add something like motion or video with sound that users can't control or take back over the screen from them. So that's what I've done with it, is say we can have fancy things, but we need the ability to let people and remember if they chose not to have those fancy things. I don't know if that answers it. Another thing, Thomas Hefner is a great plug, the Drupal accessibility channel. I know I learned something in that at least weekly, so joining the Drupal Slack for accessibility channel is outstanding.
Just real quick before I forget, Susie, could you go to the last slide for the feedback link?
Absolutely.
All sessions have a place for you to give the speakers and presentation feedback. So if you copy that link, follow that, and fill it out, we would appreciate that.
Great. I think we'll give it another minute. If there's any last minute things you want to say, definitely fill out the feedback form. Otherwise, this was an excellent session, and hang out for more sessions. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thanks everybody for your time today.